Welcome everyone to our live stream today. I'm Erika Shaker, Director of the CCPA National Office. And like so many of you, we at the CCPA are working from home during these unprecedented times, but when it comes to fighting for progressive public policy, we have never been busier. For months now, our experts have been at the forefront of the national and provincial policy debates about how best to respond to the COVID-19 crisis. And we have been very pleased to see many of our ideas and concerns addressed by federal and provincial governments. And that brings me to our guest today. Ricardo Tranjan is a senior researcher at CCPA's Ontario office, and you may recognize him from his frequent appearances on TV. Ricardo has been extremely busy the past 2 months digging into the numbers to help Canadians better understand the impact of COVID-19 on rent, affordability, and disposable income, and developing policy recommendations for how best to weather the storm. Hannah Aldridge is a research and policy analyst at Maytree, a foundation that works to advance systemic solutions to poverty in Canada through a human rights approach. She examines income security and housing need and what governments can do to address these issues. Hannah and Ricardo have collaborated on a blog we just posted yesterday, which you can find at behindthenumbers.ca. But before we bring in Ricardo and Hannah, I'd like to tell you about how you can get involved in today's conversation. We've arranged 2 different ways for you to submit your comments and questions during this live stream. The first is using the YouTube chat box, which you can see on the right side of your screen right now. If you already have a YouTube or Google account, click where it says "Say Something" and type in your questions or comments. Everyone is watching the stream right now and can also see the live chat, so feel free to strike up a conversation with other viewers. If you don't have a YouTube or Google account, or if you would prefer to submit a question privately, you can send us an email at outreach@policyalternatives.ca with the subject line "question." And it's nice to see that many of you have already done that. Either way you choose, our moderators will compile your questions behind the scenes, and we'll do our best to get to all of them before the end of the stream. And please don't be shy. Start typing your questions into the chat box or send them to us by email at any time, and we'll try to get to them in the conversation. If you receive more questions than we can get to within the hour, that gives us plenty of reason to host another conversation like this in the future. So please continue to send us your thoughts and your questions. This live streaming business is new for us, so please bear with us if any technical issues come up. And if you have feedback on the stream or suggestions for future topics you'd like to see, please do let us know. Now, while questions are coming in, and thanks so much for that, I'll kick things off by asking our guests to talk us through what they wrote in the Behind the Numbers blog. Let's begin with Ricardo. Thanks for joining us. So, COVID-19 and the response to it has thrown millions of people out of work, and people from all walks of life are facing adversity. So please help us understand the specific focus on tenants. Ricardo, take it away.
Hi, Erika, and everyone who joined us. Thank you. Thank you for joining us and for supporting our work. So what I have to say to start is that, yes, COVID has touched everyone, but it hit some harder than others. And not everyone was on equal footing to start with. And in our research and policy silos, we tend to talk about precariously employed workers and housing crisis, financial insecurities, and families' inability to build assets. And more recently, we've been talking about a affordability crisis. But once we stop talking about policy issues and we talk about people, we sort of realize we are talking about the same people. You are a low-wage worker. You spend 50% of your income on rent. TTC monthly passes it up a noticeable share of your total household income. You can afford childcare, and you can even think about buying a house or saving for retirement, right? So I look at data all day, but if data had faces, I'm sure I would be seeing the same faces over and over in my research. So then COVID happens, and then as we weather through this crisis, as a country, as a society, some of us risk becoming homeless, and others don't. And I don't mean to minimize the very serious and very concrete concerns of people who are securely housed, especially obviously health-related concerns. But losing your home having your children, all your belongings thrown out on the streets. It's one of the most devastating things that can happen to anyone. And there's rarely an easy comeback to that. So that's why the focus on renters, that's why the focus on housing at this particular time.
So tenants were struggling before the pandemic, and lockdown has just intensified that. Can you tell us a bit more, Ricardo, about what the progressive response should be outside of government?
Okay. One thing we hear a lot these days is that this crisis has simply exacerbated long-standing systemic issues, and by doing so, we sort of expose them, and then rent housing it's a great example of just that, right? Governments for years and years and years, decades actually, have failed on the housing front. And they have failed whichever you think the solution is. If you think the solution is on the supply side, governments haven't built nearly enough social housing. If you think the solution is on the demand side, we know that the support, income supports for low-income households who rent are just not there, not adequate, not in enough quantity. If you think that there's more that can be done through regulation, then you're just at loss at the fact that we don't even have rent controls. So in a situation like this, it's kind of a little bit overwhelming. It's like, where do I even start with this? And I think we should act on sort of two fronts. We need to seize the moment to expose the absurdity of a financialized housing market where one's home is someone else's financial asset. But we can't be too academic or too revolutionary and talk about only sort of this big structural change that we need. Some people are receiving eviction notes as we speak, in the midst of everything else that's going on, children without schools, health concerns, employment concerns, and they're getting like eviction notes slipped under the door on top of all the other stress that all of us are dealing with. So we have to advocate for immediate support. We have to advocate for immediate assistance for tenants, and then hope that these supports not only come through it and they support folks in the next little while, but then they start to set the foundation as well for some of the bigger changes that we want to see in the market, in the tenant housing market.
Thanks so much, Ricardo. That is incredibly useful context, and it's brought us up to speed on the issue beautifully. I'd really like to hear from Hannah. Hannah, thanks for joining us. We know a little bit more now about the difficulties tenants are facing. Can you tell us some more about the evictions prevention plan that you call for in the blog you co-authored?
Sure. Thanks very much, Erika, for inviting me and Ricardo here to speak, and to CCPA for organising the event, and also to everyone joining online. I think a lot of people are getting webinar fatigue, and there's a lot of issues to be talking about at the moment. I'm just really glad that there's a lot of interest in this renter issue, because it's one that I've been working on for a long time. Also, I want to take this opportunity to say thanks very much to Hadrian and Katie at CCPA, who are doing all this behind the scenes magic that I don't understand, but it means I just have to stand and talk at you guys today. So thank you so much, because it's bewildering. So sorry, back to the piece. So we were calling for an eviction prevention plan for Ontario, and the point of it was to highlight that one great thing about the way that provincial governments have responded to this pandemic is a evictions ban has been widely implemented across the provinces. At one point, all provinces had one in place. And that's great, because it means that if you've lost your job, you don't have to worry about imminently losing your home. But if you've lost your job, you still have to worry about paying the rents. Like, if you don't pay the rent, you won't get evicted tomorrow, but you know that this eviction ban is temporary. So what's going to happen then? And we haven't seen the same kind of response from governments to deal with this issue. So the most kind of direct response we've seen has been in BC, who introduced a temporary rental supplement. And what they did there was they kind of targeted people. You had to meet 3 categories. One of them was that you were kind of on a lower to modest income before the pandemic, that you've seen a sort of significant drop in your income as a result of the pandemic, and that you spend more than 30% of your income on rent. So if you meet that criteria, then the BC government will give you $300 per month for 3 months to help you with your rent, or $500 if you're in a family with dependents. But we don't have that kind of program in Ontario, and the housing cost issue is just as significant here. So our kind of piece looks at, well, what would happen if you provided that kind of support in Ontario? And we calculate that we think around 185,000 households would benefit. And then also we thought, well, what are the different options? If you were going to say we were playing around with policy here, how might you tweak it? And we wondered, well, what would happen if, say, you expanded that program to people who are struggling to pay the rent but don't necessarily, say, qualify for the Canada Emergency Response Benefit because you're still in work, but actually the income that you take home from that isn't that much higher than what people who are out of work and getting this benefit are getting. So if you expanded that eligibility, you'd be reaching about 340,000 households to help them pay rent. But I think the key takeaway is that there are 2 things that we can see from the BC program. One of them is that it works. If you look at the rates of non-payment of rent in April and May, it's been much lower in BC because this program has been in place. And the other takeaway is that when they introduced this program, it was announced and applications were open within 15 days. It's not too late for other provinces to respond like this. It's the sort of program that works and can be quickly implemented. And we'd like to see the problem of building rent arrears dealt with.
So the relief program would be a way to deal with the imminent crisis around rent arrears, but it doesn't appear to address some of the longer term problems that Ricardo just told us about. What do you think the province can do in that area?
Yeah, exactly. So to weather this pandemic, we're going to need we need a response now, but there are going to be stages. There'll be the kind of going back to whatever the new normal is. And we're going to need different policies at different times. The evictions ban and a sort of an emergency renter relief are emergency measures. They're not permanent measures that we are calling for. And what we need after that is an off-ramp. We need sort of ways to help us get back to a better system where people aren't so reliant on these kind of measures. And so what we'd like to see is the provincial government be very careful and take very seriously how it lifts the eviction ban to make sure that people's right to adequate housing is never compromised, particularly as we don't know at this stage whether or not there'll be a second wave, whether or not there'll be another lockdown. People may be losing their jobs for a second time in the coldest months of the year. That's not the time to be threatened with eviction. So we want to see very careful liftings of the eviction ban. And then in the longer term, how can we make the rental market a more kind of predictable and realistic market to navigate, where you're not worried about being evicted because your rent is going up to a point where you can't afford. So we'd like to see rent controls applied more sort of fairly and comprehensively.
Thank you both for answering my questions and helping set the scene for all of us. So I'd love to turn now to our viewers' questions. Don't forget, you can email your questions to us at outreach@policyalternatives.ca, or you can just respond in the chat on the right-hand side of your screen. So our first question has just come in. Are there protections for tenants who have been told during the pandemic that they will be evicted? Ricardo, did you want to start with that?
Yes. My understanding is that there is no protections. So even the eviction bans were, in most part, only partial, in the sense that people could not be put out on the streets, during the lockdown, during the while the ban is in place, but that did not mean that eviction processes could not be rolling. That did not mean that landlords couldn't get the ball rolling in case people fall into arrears. And so my sense is that there's no real protections, and hence we're so concerned about, you evict, you lift the bans, and then what?
Hannah, did you have anything you'd like to add to that, or should we move on to our next question?
I can just kind of add to what Ricardo was saying. Certainly in Ontario, what is kind of banned is the sort of when a landlord invokes the landlord-tenant board. That's what they can't do, but they can easily serve a tenant a notice saying, I'm going to evict you, and it's up to the tenant to know, like, if the tenant doesn't know their rights, that they don't have to be evicted. Often when people are presented with that notice, they just think, okay, I'm being evicted. I don't want to be homeless. I need to act now. I'm going to find somewhere else to live. And there's nothing that's stopping people from doing that. And what's unfortunate is we don't know how widespread this is because there's no kind of process to register an eviction notice.
Thanks, Hannah. The next question we have is a very popular one, judging from the responses to this conversation. How can we protect renters living in illegal secondary suites? Hannah, why don't we stay with you?
Sure. So with I guess there's two kind of responses to this question. There is the how do you protect renters right now who are in illegal secondary suites? Because sort of things like our housing benefit relief program, it might be hard for people to access that kind of support if they don't feel that their tenancy is legitimate. They don't want to come out. So what I would advocate for is, with these kinds of programs, also having another kind of indirect discretionary channel. So we need to make sure that we still support the kind of informal rent banks where people say who don't have legal status in Canada can access rent supports and people in illegal suites. Then in the long term, you'd want to sort of consider legislation to legalize these kind of secondary suites to make sure that these people can enjoy the rights of all other tenants in recognized tenancies. But I think Ricardo also has things to add as well.
Yes, I would speak mostly to the Toronto context, where tenants in either rooming houses, as they are often referred to, or the multi-tenant homes, which is a much better name for it, on a good day, they don't have any protection. They're in an extremely vulnerable situation. They're literally a step away from homelessness. They can come back any day from work and the room is just locked because the landlord decided so, and they have very little tools to deal with that situation. So what we need in the long term is it's for governments to actually act on it and to actually regulate it, as Hannah was saying. So in the context of Toronto, for example, what that would take, it would take a mayor. It would take a mayor that makes that a priority, that cares enough about the issue, because the city right now is a patchwork of areas where there is legal and areas where there's illegal rooming houses. It kind of dates back from the amalgamation and the fact that the new city of Toronto never dealt with that issue. And it has been many attempts to deal with this in the past, but it kind of always gets kind of stuck in the political process because a lot of councillors, they succumb to the local NIMBYism and then they block legislation. So what we need is a mayor that whips the vote, that makes that a priority, and that acts on it so that folks living in those type of housing, they actually have protections. Sadly, John Tory doesn't seem to be your guy. He has been dancing on this fire for 6 years. Staff from all sorts of different divisions within the city of Toronto have tried to move on this issue, but there has been no political leadership so far.
Thanks, Ricardo. And I just want to remind folks watching, you don't have to be shy. You can ask a question by entering it into the chat on the right side of your screen, or by emailing us at outreach@policyalternatives.ca. We would love to hear from you. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as possible. Another popular question, rental housing is treated as an investment commodity, not a human right. How can we change this? Ricardo, let's start with you this time.
Yes, exactly. When I was earlier when I was referring to the sort of long-standing and systemic issues in the tenant housing market, that's something that has long existed, but we have seen sort of getting worse and worse in the last few years, is the fact that landlords are increasingly not only larger corporations, but a number of them are now these financialized instruments. They're like called REITs, real estate investment trusts. These are essentially investment firms that buy a lot of housing and sell them as shares for anyone really can buy them. And it's usually advertised as very low risk, really good return. So great for example, people who need to invest in their pensions and so on and so forth. And these investment firms, they have very little, if any, contact at all with the tenants, with the local contacts. It's just an asset for them, and they're trading them. And that's not really the way we need to treat homes and houses and people's rights to be housed. So yes, we would definitely need a move away from that model. And also just to emphasize that now about 20% of all the rental units in the country are owned by about 20 of those large companies. So they're increasingly the real face of your landlords.
Hannah, I know you feel strongly about this as well. Did you want to add to Ricardo's comments?
Yeah, no, I'd be happy to. So at Maytree, our stick is social and economic rights. So it's a great thing to be able to speak to this question and also to have it asked, because we talk about the right to housing a lot, and it's really nice to know that other people are thinking about it. This idea is really getting traction. So sort of, I'd like to strike a slightly optimistic note in that I do think the right to housing is increasingly being recognised by policymakers, especially in Canada federally. There was quite a significant milestone last year with the National Housing Strategy Act. And then in the City of Toronto, where I am, the housing TO plan recognises housing as a human right. But obviously we aren't there yet. It's pretty clear. But there's a receptiveness towards getting there. So I'm quite excited about that. And I think one thing that we need to be mindful of is that it isn't something that happens overnight. It is going to be this kind of relentless push from people who care about the right to housing to monitor and to make sure that governments live up to their promises. And in the meantime, I think one thing that I would like to see governments do, and one thing that we should be checking that governments do, is that in every kind of policy decision that they make, we want to make sure that A, it advances the right to housing, like this is a step forward, and B, that it prioritizes those most in need. So it's something that is benefiting the people who are street homeless and not the REITs.
Thank you, Hannah. And if you're just joining us, my name is Erika Shaker. I'm director of the CCPA National Office. I'm joined today by CCPA-Ontario senior researcher, Ricardo Tranjan, and Maytree's Hannah Aldridge, and we're discussing policy recommendations targeting rental evictions during COVID-19. I'd like to bring, this is the first question that's actually come from the live chat, so thank you for sending this. How can renter protections be included in a post-COVID just recovery? Ricardo, what do you have to say?
In the eviction strategy plan that Hannah, myself, and our colleague Garima published yesterday, we call for the rent support, the income supports to help tenants to make rent, but we also call for rent controls. And I think rent controls are important now because it makes no sense to be raising rent through an economic and health crisis. and they need to stay in place for a long time. And they need to expand it from just rent controls on occupied units to also vacant units. And this is a really important distinction, and it goes back a little bit to our previous question about the financialization of housing and housing being treated as a financial asset versus a human right. So the importance of rent control for someone who is currently occupying a home, it's obvious, right? You want to know how much the rent can increase by, you need to budget for it, you need it to not increase faster than your own income. Otherwise, you become increasingly vulnerable, financially speaking. But the vacancy controls are also incredibly important, because what happens is that when you do not have, and you mostly don't, any control on the price of a unit once it becomes vacant. So I'm renting this place, I decide to leave, and then when I leave, my landlord can simply discharge the next tenant whatever price he or she thinks it's fair, depending on how much he or she thinks they can get for it. What that does is that it creates an incentive for pushing tenants out. It creates an incentive for the so-called renovictions. It creates a context in which a lot of the large REITs or very large asset management companies right now, they are not necessarily worried about rents falling in arrears and eventually being evicted, because they know that there's a high profit margin to be made once those folks get evicted because they couldn't make it, and then the next tenant coming in and paying a lot more for however long they stay. So a few months of rent that they might have to forego and not receive, but in contrast, they get someone paying higher rents for many years, and that makes up for the loss. And you see, even often in their reports, they celebrate the fact that they managed to increase the values of a property higher on average, more than the guidelines, because of the turnover. So it's incredibly important to talk about vacancy controls. Sometimes people talk about implementation and how complicated that would be. I don't think that it's a problem. I think it's doable. Our public service is extremely competent, and they can deal with things like this. So for me, that's the one that I would really, really emphasize. Rent controls, including vacancy controls now and moving forward.
Thank you for that, Ricardo. I've got another question that's just come in, also off the live chat. So thank you for that. How can renter protections be included? Sorry, as eviction freezes end, what can be done to protect tenants with rent arrears? Hannah, why don't you take this one?
Sure. This is actually one thing that I've been thinking about at work quite a lot recently. And all of these thoughts are very kind of in their early stages. So I do apologize if some of them sound absurd. But essentially, what I've been thinking about is, okay, how can you lift the evictions ban without leading to mass evictions? We'd like to see a kind of renter support to help people stay on top of their arrears. But there are still likely to be people who fall through those gaps. There will be people who aren't able to stay on top of their rent. So one thing that sort of I've been considering is the scope for some kind of way to lift the evictions ban, but maybe have a kind of period of time when, if you accumulated arrears between the start of the lockdown and the end of the lockdown, you cannot be evicted for those rent arrears, because they were not, so there was nothing you could do about it. So how can you kind of implement something like that, but also like making sure that there are protections for, or that you're not just giving people a rent holiday to the point where, say, small landlords who don't have income coming in are kind of lost. So I'd like to be able to see a way that people are protected from evictions during that period, but then are also kind of offered something that they can repay those rent arrears in a way that is manageable to them, that is sustainable and is practical, so that they can kind of recover without fearing the loss of their home.
Thank you, Hannah. Ricardo, is there anything you wanted to add?
No,
Okay.
I think Hannah covered it all.
Perfect. Then let's move on to the next question. This one also came in over email, and it appeared to be a very popular one. What can be done about renovictions? Ricardo, why don't you take that one?
Yes, I think I won't repeat myself too much, but I think it's the importance of vacancy controls. Again, you have to essentially move the market incentive for kicking out tenants. A landlord, once they have someone renting a place and that person is there and it's paying rent and it's being a good tenant, there's got to be an incentive to just keep them there and not have either the right or a profit motive to kick them out. And that's not how the market is right now. It's right now. So that's, I think, a very obvious one. And then the second one, there's a bigger question about enforcement and what happens when you have governments that have been just faced with austerity for now a couple of decades. And one of the things that we know is that enforcement capacity goes out of the window, be it in long-term care homes, be it in schools, be it ability to enforce labor legislation, be it ability to enforce some of the rent controls. So that speaks to the broader question of once the governments put in place good legislation, once they put in place good quality standards for some of the public services and or privately provided services, the next step is to make sure that we have enforcement capacity. Otherwise, it doesn't do the trick that we expect it to do.
Thank you so much, Ricardo. Hannah, I have another question, and I'm going to suggest that you answer this because you've already alluded to it a little bit. This is about landlords. Well, this is actually also a popular question. What if your landlord is a homeowner using your rent for mortgage payments? How will these homeowners survive the crisis?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's I'm a renter, and it's very easy to demonize the landlords as this one sort of group of disparate profit makers. But I think it's important that we remember that many of them aren't, and that there is actually a real risk here of people, if renters aren't able to pay their rent, not only are they at risk of eviction, but it's the landlords who are relying on that income who are struggling to put food on the table. So I absolutely agree with the sentiment. The point of, say, the renter relief program that we're calling for is intended to help renters pay the rent. So that kind of, it's intended to benefit both the renter and the landlord to make sure that the cash is still flowing. And again, in the kind of longer term, I think we need to be very mindful of how you can kind of, when I was talking, I kind of alluded to kind of an affordable repayment plan for people who are in arrears, like how can they pay back their rent arrears gradually? One very important aspect of that is making sure that the landlord is able to say, take the hit. And if they aren't able to kind of wait for that gradual repayment, what kind of financial supports can be put in place to sort of maybe give the landlord a bit of leeway there where it's absolutely necessary. Oh, Ricardo would like to add something from what I can tell.
Yes, I wanted to disagree with Hannah a little bit. I wanted just to emphasize that, yes, not all landlords or some large company or a real estate investment company, but it's not many of them that aren't. As part of our response to the crisis, we actually crunched the numbers because I was concerned about it too. And I was like, okay, how many in Canada, how many homeowners rent a share of their home? So they only own one home and they're renting part of this. And we can assume that the reason they're doing it is obviously because they need that income. Without that income, they won't be able to pay for their own bills. They won't be able to pay their mortgage. And what I found out, according to 2016 Stats Can data, is that only about 4% of all homeowners in Canada are in that position. So yes, absolutely. Let's think about them. Let's make sure that the burden of the economic crisis triggered by COVID doesn't fall on them shoulders. I too have had incredible landlords, and I want them to be well. But let's not that notion, which is a little bit romanticized, of the landlord being, the nice little widow down the street who rents a bedroom apartment, just kind of clutter our judgment about the big picture and the fact that nowadays there's 20 companies, most of whom are not even based in Canada or necessarily based in Canada, that owns 20% of all the rental units in the country. And they have been bragging about how much money they make. You can go online and you see that, because since they're an investment trust, it's of the interest to promote how much money they make. So they've been bragging about how much money they make, how profitable they are. And that is most likely, that's the most common face of the landlord. So by all means, let's support those homeowners who are renting their home. And it's actually a great idea to support them. So then we can say, okay, what about the rest now? What's the adequate policy solution for them? Because a lot of business are going to incur a lot of losses. So the bakery down the street was going to incur a lot of losses. And so why should we be absolutely concerned about making those business whole in the end of this crisis if everyone else is taking a hit? That was all.
Ricardo, we actually have a bit of a follow-up question. Is that 4% of homeowners or 4% of landlords?
Of homeowners.
Okay, thank you. Just a reminder that you can ask a question by entering it into the chat on the right side of your screen or by emailing us at outreach@policyalternatives.ca. Please don't be shy. I'm joined today by CCPA-Ontario Senior Researcher Ricardo Tranjan and Maytree's Hannah Aldridge, and we're discussing policy recommendations targeting rental evictions during COVID-19. So the next question, is there a role for the federal government in providing rent relief? Hannah, why don't you take this?
Sure. There absolutely can be. I'm not fussy. I want there to be a renter relief. I don't care which level of government does it. I guess that's the short answer. Does Ricardo have anything to add?
I think the federal government came through to provide some rent relief for commercial tenants. So I think there's a precedent to say the federal government too could do something. But then, like our paper yesterday focused mostly on Ontario because the government of Ontario so far has done actually very little in terms of income supports to families and communities. It has deliver some packages on the health front, but anything or most things that folks are seeing in terms of direct support to community or to families has been coming directly through the federal government. And again, in a way, I'm not fussy. Like Hannah said, I want people to be supported. I want families to receive the assistance that they need. But there's something to be said about the Ontario government doing very little in concrete terms to support families and households.
Thank you for that, Ricardo. The pandemic has revealed systemic negligence that vulnerable renters, specifically seniors and disabled renters, are experiencing. So how can we ensure provincial income assistance programs cover the real cost of rent? Ricardo, do you want to start with this?
I will pass it to Hannah because she's much more knowledgeable on this issue than I am. So let her take the first crack at it.
Sure. So if you look at what social assistance rates are across Canada, unless you're on social assistance, could be it for real. I think you would be staggered by how the rates compare to what actual rents are, because most social assistance recipients aren't in RGI housing. They are renting from private landlords, and the math just doesn't work. Like how anybody this is why we have food banks. So yeah, I think it's been an issue for a very long time, and the pandemic has really highlighted how out of whack these rates are. So I would say that this is quite consistent across Canada. What I would like to see is a realignment of social assistance rates towards what rents actually are, especially the shelter component. I mean, one way that you could start by fixing that is saying, well, whatever in Ontario, whatever the landlord tenant board says rents can go up by, shelter rates will go up by the same amount, because it doesn't work like that. It doesn't work automatically. They aren't aligned like that. And then also, I think maybe you would want to look to Manitoba, which I believe is the only province which has kind of really attempted to separate out kind of rental supports from social assistance. So if you're on social assistance or if you're on a low income, you can apply for the Manitoba Rent Assist, which is much more closely aligned to what the market actually charges. But it also means that if you come off social assistance, you can still access this renter support. So I would say that Manitoba is a good example of one way that we can kind of start to make income supports for the most vulnerable in society more aligned to what they actually need to pay the rent.
Thank you for that, Hannah. And I'm going to suggest we stick with you for this, what I think is actually our last question. As a low-income renter, what's the best way to advocate for adequate, affordable shelter for myself and others?
Yeah, I have to confess I'm not an advocate. I'm a policy analyst. I sit at a desk all day and do similar things to Ricardo. I stare at numbers, but I work with some brilliant advocates, and Maytree, my organisation, support those advocates. And I would say if you want to advocate for lower income renters, the best way to do it is to work collectively. And there are organisations out there who are sort of already doing this kind of thing. They do great work. And so I would recommend anyone wanting to get involved, get in touch with the FMTA, and Acorn, your local Acorn chapter. Both of these organisations work with low-income people to organise collective action. FMTA is specifically focused around renting issues.
Ricardo, did you have any comments? Do you want to follow up on that?
Yes. Likewise, I don't have any skills or experience organizing at the community level. I organize numbers and semi-columns all day long. That's what I do for a living. But I have an incredible respect for those who do that work, because it's extremely difficult. And I think my comment is not direct so much at them, but at folks like me, like the people doing the policy work, doing the research and the data crunching and policy analysis type of work. And I think it's incredibly important that we keep connected to what people are experiencing on the ground, what they are doing, what they're asking, and sort of put our research skills at their service now more than ever.
Thank you for that. And it's actually, unfortunately, time to wrap up. Hannah, Ricardo, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks to our audience for their fantastic questions, both in the chat and the ones that were sent in advance over email. If you found this conversation useful, and I really hope you did, please consider making a donation so we can continue to keep you informed on these policy issues, and so we can keep hearing from you and answering your questions. There's a link in the video description below, or you can go to policyalternatives.ca/give. As I said at the outset, putting this live stream together has been a learning experience for us. So if you have any feedback about the stream or suggestions for future topics you'd like to hear from us on, please do let us know. Thanks so much for joining us today. We look forward to hearing from you soon, and stay safe.